Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, Part 1, Chapter 11. The night was impenetrably dark. The moon had been rising later and later every night, until now it was seen only at dawn. And whenever the moon forsook evening and rose at cock-crow, the nights were as black as charcoal. Ezinma and her mother sat on a mat on the floor after their supper of yam fufu and bitter leaf soup. A palm oil lamp gave out yellowish light. Without it, it would have been impossible to eat. One could not have known where one's mouth was in the darkness of that night. There was an oil lamp in all the 4 huts on Okonkwo's compound, and each hut, seen from the others, looked like a soft eye of yellow half-light seen in the solid massiveness of night. The world was silent except the shrill cry of insects, which was part of the night, and the sound of wooden mortar and pestle as Nwanyeke pounded her fufu. Nwanyeke lived 4 compounds away, and she was notorious for her late cooking. Every woman in the neighborhood knew the sound of Nwanyeke's mortar and pestle. It was also part of the night. Okonkwo had eaten from his wife's dishes and was now reclining with his back against the wall. He searched his bag and brought out his snuff bottle. He turned it onto his left palm, but nothing came out. He hit the bottle against his knee to shake up the tobacco. That was always the trouble with Okeke's snuff. It very quickly went damp, and there was too much saltpeter in it. Okonkwo had not bought snuff from him for a long time. Idigo was the man who knew how to grind good snuff, but he had recently fallen ill. Low voices, broken now and again by singing, reached Okonkwo from his wife's hut as each woman and her children told folk stories. Ekwefi and her daughter Ezinma sat on a mat on the floor. It was Ekwefi's turn to tell a story. "Once upon a time," she began, "as the birds were invited to a feast in the sky, they were very happy and began to prepare themselves for the great day. They painted their bodies with red camwood and drew beautiful patterns on them with uli. Tortoise saw all these preparations and soon discovered what it all meant. Nothing that happened in the world of the animals ever escaped his notice. He was full of cunning. As soon as he heard of the great feast in the sky, his throat began to itch at the very thought. There was a famine in those days, and Tortoise had not eaten a good meal for 2 months. His body rattled like a piece of dry stick in his empty shell, so he began to plan how he would go to the sky. But he had no wings," said Ezinma. "Be patient," replied her mother. "That is the story. Tortoise had no wings, but he went to the birds and asked to be allowed to go with them. 'We know you too well,' said the birds when they heard him. 'You are full of cunning and you are ungrateful. If we allow you to come with us, you will soon begin your mischief.' 'You do not know me,' said Tortoise. 'I am a changed man. I have learned that a man who makes trouble for others is also making it for himself.' Tortoise had a sweet tongue, and with a short time all the birds agreed that he was a changed man, and they each gave him a feather, with which he made 2 wings. At last the great day came, and Tortoise was the first to arrive at the meeting place. When all the birds had gathered together, they set off in a body. Tortoise was very happy and voluble as he flew among the birds, and he was soon chosen as the man to speak for the party because he was a great orator. "There is one important thing which we must not forget," he said as he flew on their way. "When people are invited to a great feast like this, they take new names for the occasion. Our host in the sky will expect us to honor this age-old custom." None of the birds had heard of this custom, But they knew that Tortoise, in spite of his failings in other directions, was a widely traveled man who knew the custom of different peoples. And so they each took a new name. When they had all taken, Tortoise also took one. He was to be called All of You. At last the party arrived in the sky, and their hosts were very happy to see them. Tortoise stood up in his many-colored plumage and thanked them for their invitation. His speech was so eloquent that all the birds were glad they had brought him, and nodded their heads in approval of all he said. Their host took him as the king of the birds, especially as he looked somewhat different from the others. After kola nut had been presented and eaten, the people of the sky set before their guest the most delectable dishes Tortoise had ever seen or dreamed of. The soup was brought out hot from the fire and in the very pot in which it had been cooked. It was full of meat and fish. Tortoise began to sniff aloud. There was pounded yam and also yam pottage cooked with palm oil and fresh fish. There was also pot of palm wine. When everything had been set before the guest, one of the people of the sky came forward and tasted a little from each pot. He then invited the birds to eat, but Tortoise jumped to his feet and asked, "For whom have you prepared this feast?" "For all of you," replied the man. Tortoise turned to the birds and said, "You remember that my name is All of You. The custom here is to serve the spokesman first and the others later. They will serve you when I have eaten." He began to eat, and the birds grumbled angrily. The people of the sky thought it must be their custom to leave all the food for their king, and so Tortoise ate the best part of the food and then drank 2 pots of palm wine, so that he was full of food and drink, and his body filled out in his shell. The birds gathered round to eat what was left and to peck at the bones he had thrown all about the floor. Some of them were too angry to eat. They chose to fly home on an empty stomach. But before they left, each took back the feather he had lent to Tortoise. And there he stood in his hard shell full of food and wine without any wings to fly home. He asked the birds to take a message for his wife, but they all refused. In the end, Parrot, who had felt more angry than the others, suddenly changed his mind and agreed to take the message. "Tell my wife," said Tortoise, "to bring out all the soft things in my house and cover the compound with them, so that I can jump down from the sky without very great danger." Parrot promised to deliver the message and then flew away. But when he reached Tortoise's house, he told his wife to bring out all the hard things in the house, and so she brought out her husband's hoe, machetes, spears, guns, and even his cannon. Tortoise looked down from the sky and saw his wife bringing out things, but it was too far to see what they were. When all seemed ready, he let himself go. He fell and fell and fell until he began to fear that he would never stop falling, and then, like the sound of his cannon, he crashed on the compound. "Did he die?" asked Ezinma. "No," replied Ekwefi. His shell broke into pieces, but there was a great medicine man in the neighborhood. Tortoise's wife sent for him, and he gathered all the bits of shell and stuck them together. That is why Tortoise's shell is not smooth. "There is no song in the story," Ezinma pointed out. "No," said Ekwefi. "I shall think of another one with a song, but it is your own turn." "Once upon a time," Ezinma began, "tortoise and cat went to wrestle against yams." "No, that is not the beginning." "Once upon a time, there was a great famine in the land of animals. Everybody was lean except Cat, who was fat and whose body shone as if oil was rubbed on it." She broke off because at that very moment a loud and high-pitched voice broke the outer silence of the night. It was Chielo, the priestess of Agbala, prophesying. There was nothing new in that. Once in a while, Chielo was possessed by the spirit of her god, and she began to prophesy. But tonight, she was addressing her prophecy and greetings to Okonkwo, and so everyone in his family listened. The folk stories stopped. Abalado, abalekeneyo, came the voice like a sharp knife cutting through the night. Okonkwo, abalekenegyo, abalacholifu adaya Ezinma. At the mention of Ezinma's name, Ekwefi jerked her head sharply, like an animal that has sniffed death in the air. Her heart jumped painfully within her. The priestess had now reached the Okonkwo's compound and was talking with him outside his hut. She was saying again and again that Agbala wanted to see his daughter Ezinma. Okonkwo pleaded with her to come back in the morning because Ezinma was now asleep. But Chielo ignored what he was trying to say and went on shouting that Agbala wanted to see his daughter. Her voice was as clear as metal, and Okonkwo's women and children heard from their huts all that she said. Okonkwo was still pleading that the girl had been ill of late and was asleep. Ekwefi quickly took her to their bedroom and placed her on their high bamboo bed. The priestess screamed, "Beware, Okonkwo!" she warned. "Beware of exchanging words with Agbala. Does a man speak when a god speaks? Beware!" She walked through Okonkwo's hut into the circular compound and went straight towards Ekwefi's hut. Okonkwo came after her. "Ekwefi," she called, "Agbala greets you. Where is my daughter Ezinma? Agbala wants to see her." Ekwefi came out from her hut carrying her oil lamp in her left hand. There was a light wind blowing, so she cupped her right hand to shelter the flame. Nwoye's mother, also carrying an oil lamp, emerged from her hut. The children stood in the darkness outside their hut watching the strange event. Okonkwo's youngest wife also came out and joined the others. "Where does Agbala want to see her?" Ekwefi asked. "Where else but in his house in the hills and the caves," replied the priestess. "I will come with you too," Ekwefi said firmly. "To fear!" the priestess cursed, her voice cracking like the angry bark of thunder in the dry season. "How dare you, woman, to go before the mighty Agbala of your own accord? Beware, woman, lest he strike you in his anger. Bring me my daughter." Ekwefi went into her hut and came out again with Ezinma. "Come, my daughter," said the princess. "I shall carry you on my back. A baby on its mother's back does not know that the way is long." Ezinma began to cry. She was used to Chielo calling her my daughter, but it was a different Chielo she now saw in the yellow half-light. "Don't cry, my daughter," said the princess, "lest Agbala be angry with you." "Don't cry," said Ekwefi. "She will bring you back very soon. I shall give you some fish to eat." She went into the hut again and brought down the smoke-black basket in which she kept her dried fish and other ingredients for cooking soup. She brought a piece in two and gave it to Ezinma, who clung to her. "Don't be afraid," said Ekwefi, stroking her head, which was shaved in places, leaving a regular pattern of hair. They went outside again. The priestess bent down on one knee and Ezinma climbed on her back, her left palm closed on her fish and her eyes gleaming with tears. "Abalado, abalekeneyo." Chielo began once again to chant greetings to her god. She turned round sharply and walked through Okonkwo's hut, bending very low at the eaves. Ezinma was crying loudly now, calling on her mother. The two voices disappeared into the thick darkness. A strange and sudden weakness descended on Ekwefi as she stood gazing in the direction of the voices like a hen whose only chick has been carried away by a kite. Ezinma's voice soon faded away, and only Chielo was heard moving farther and farther into the distance. "Why do you stand there as though she had been kidnapped?" asked Okonkwo as he went back to his hut. "She will bring her back soon," Moye's mother said. But Ekwefi did not hear these consolations. She stood for a while, and then all of a sudden made up her mind. She hurried through Okonkwo's hut and went outside. "Where are you going?" he asked. "I am following Chielo," she replied and disappeared into the darkness. Okonkwo cleared his throat and brought out his snuff bottle from the goatskin bag by his side. The priestess' voice was already growing faint in the distance. Ekwefi hurried to the main footpath and turned left in the direction of the voice. Her eyes were useless to her in the darkness, but she picked her way easily on the sandy footpath hedged on either side by branches and damp leaves. She began to run, holding her breast with her hands to stop them flanging noisily against her body. She hit her left foot against an outcropped root, and terror seized her. It was an ill omen. She ran faster, but Chielo's voice was still a long way away. Had she been running too? How could she go so fast with Ezinma on her back? Although the night was cool, Ekwefi was beginning to feel hot from her running. She continually ran into the luxuriant weeds and creepers that walled in the path. Once she tripped up and fell. Only then did she realize with a start that Chielo had stopped her chanting. Her heart beat violently, and she stood still. Then Chielo's renewed outburst came from only a few paces ahead, but Ekwefi could not see her. She shut her eyes for a while and opened them again in an effort to see, but it was useless. She could not see beyond her nose. There were no stars in the sky because there was a rain cloud. Fireflies went about with their tiny green lamps, which only made the darkness more profound. Between Chielo's outburst, the night was alive with the shrill tremor of forest insects woven into the darkness. "Abalado! Abalekeneyo!" Ekwefi trudged behind, neither getting too near nor keeping too far back. She thought they must be going towards the sacred cave. Now that she walked slowly, she had time to think. What would she do when they get to the cave? She would not dare to enter. She would wait at the mouth, all alone in that fearful place. She thought of all the terrors of the night. She remembered that night long ago when she had seen Obuagaliodo, one of those evil essence loosed upon the world by the potent medicines which the tribe had made in the distant past against its enemies, but had now forgotten how to control. Ekwefi had been returning from the stream with her mother on a dark night like this when they saw its glow as it flew in their direction. They had thrown down their water pots and lain by the roadside, expecting the sinister light to descend on them and kill them. That was the only time Ekwefi ever saw Obuagaliodo. But although it had happened so long ago, her blood still ran cold whenever she remembered that night. The priestess' voice came at longer intervals now, but its vigor was undiminished. The air was cool and damp with dew. Ezinma sneezed. Ekwefi muttered, "Life to you." At the same time, the priestess also said, "Life to you, my daughter." Ezinma's voice from the darkness warmed her mother's heart. She trudged slowly along, and then the priestess screamed, "Somebody is walking behind me," she said. "Whether you are a spirit or man, may Agbala shave your head with a blunt razor. May he twist your neck until you see your heels." Ekwefi stood rooted to the spot. One mind said to her, "Woman, go home before Agbala does you harm." But she could not. She stood until Chielo had increased the distance between them, and she began to follow again. She had already walked so long that she began to feel a slight numbness in the limbs and in the head. Then it occurred to her that they could not have been heading for the cave. They must have bypassed it long ago. They must be going towards Omuachi, the father's village in the clan. Chielo's voice now came after long intervals. It seemed to Ekwefi that the night had become a little lighter. The cloud had lifted, and a few stars were out. The moon must be preparing to rise, its sullenness over. When the moon rose late in the night, people said it was refusing food, as a sullen husband refuses his wife's food when they have quarreled. "Agbalado, Omuachi, Agbalekene unu." It was just as Ekwefi had thought. The priestess was now saluting the village of Omuachi. It was unbelievable, the distance they had covered. As they emerged into the open village from the narrowest forest track, the darkness was softened, and it became possible to see the vague shape of trees. Ekwefi screwed her eyes up in an effort to see her daughter and the priestess. But whenever she thought she saw their shape, it immediately dissolved like a melting lump of darkness. She walked numbly along. Chielo's voice was now rising continuously, as when she first set out. Ekwefi had a feeling of spacious openness, and she guessed they must be on the village Ilo or playground. And she realized too with something like a jerk that Chielo was no longer moving forward. She was in fact returning. Ekwefi quickly moved away from her line of retreat. Chielo passed by and then began to go back the way she had come. It was a long and weary journey, and Ekwefi felt like a sleepwalker most of the way. The moon was definitely rising, and although it had not yet appeared on the sky, its light had already melted down the darkness. Ekwefi could now discern the figure of the priestess and her burden. She slowed down her pace so as to increase the distance between them. She was afraid of what might happen if Chielo suddenly turned round and saw her. She had prayed for the moon to rise, but now she found the half-light of the incipient moon more terrifying than darkness. The world was now peopled with vague, fantastic figures that dissolved under her steady gaze and then formed again in new shapes. At one stage, Ekwefi was so afraid that she nearly called out to Chielo for companionship and human sympathy. What she had seen was the shape of a man climbing a palm tree, his head pointing to the earth and his legs skywards. But at that very moment, Chielo's voice rose again in her possessed chanting, and Ekwefi recalled because there was no humanity there. It was not the same Chielo who sat with her in the market and sometimes bought bean cakes for Ezinma, whom she called her daughter. It was a different woman, the priestess of Agbala, the oracle of the hills and caves. Ekwefi trudged along between two fears. The sound of her benumbed step seemed to come from some other person walking behind her. Her arms were folded across her bare breast. Dew fell heavily and the air was cold. She could no longer think, not even about the terrors of the night. She just jogged along in a half-sleep, only waking to full life when Chielo sang. At last they took a turning and began to head for the caves. From then on, Chielo never ceased in her chanting. She greeted her God in a multitude of names, the owner of the future, the messenger of earth, the god who cut a man down when his life was sweetest to him. Ekwefi was also awakened and her benumbed fears revived. The moon was now up and she could see Chielo and Ezinma clearly. How a woman could carry a child for that size so easily and for so long was a miracle. But Ekwefi was not thinking about that. Chielo was not a woman that night. Agbalado, agbala ekene yo. Chidegbu mmadụ mbọsị ndụ ya na-atọ ya ụtọ daalụ o. Ekwefi could already see the hills looming in the moonlight. They formed a circular ring with a break at one point through which the foot track led to the center of the circle. As soon as the priestess stepped into this ring of hills, her voice was not only doubled in strength, but was thrown back on all sides. It was indeed the shrine of a great god. Ekwefi picked her way carefully and quietly. She was already beginning to doubt the wisdom of her coming. Nothing would happen to Ezinma, she thought. And if anything happened to her, could she stop it? She would not dare to enter the underground caves. Her coming was quite useless, she thought. As these things went through her mind, she did not realize how close they were to the cave mouth, and so when the priestess with Ezinma on her back disappeared through a hole hardly big enough to pass a hen, Ekwefi broke into a run as though to stop them. As she stood gazing at the circular darkness which had swallowed them, tears gushed from her eyes, and she swore within her that if she heard Ezinma cry, she would rush into the cave to defend her against all the gods in the world. She would die for her. Having sworn that oath, she sat down on a stony ledge and waited. Her fear had vanished. She could hear the priestess' voice, all its metal taken out by it by the vast emptiness of the cave. She buried her face in her lap and waited. She did not know how long she waited. It must have been a very long time. Her back was turned on the footpath that led out of the hills. She must have heard a noise behind her, and she turned round sharply. A man stood there with a machete in his hand. Ekwefi uttered a scream and sprang to her feet. "Don't be foolish," said Okonkwo's voice. "I thought you were going into the shrine with Chielo," he mocked. Ekwefi did not answer. Tears of gratitude filled her eyes. She knew her daughter was safe. "Go home and sleep," said Okonkwo. "I shall wait here." "I shall wait too. It is almost dawn. The first cock has crowed." As they stood there together, Ekwefi's mind went back to the days when they were young. She had married Anene because Okonkwo was too poor then to marry. 2 years after her marriage to Anene, she could bear it no longer, and she ran away to Okonkwo. It had been early in the morning. The moon was shining. She was going to the stream to fetch water. Okonkwo's house was on the way to the stream. She went in and knocked at his door, and he came out. Even in those days, he was not a man of many words. He just carried her into his bed, and in darkness began to feel around her waist for the loose end of her cloth.